Hello, lovelies. Today I've got something weird, special, obscure for you. From the depths of my RPG archives, we have Dicing with Dragons, which is a generalized introduction to role-playing games by Ian Livingstone. Yes, that Ian Livingstone. And this was written in 1982. There was a second edition in 1983. And this is what Ian Livingstone looked like in 1982. Hard to believe it's the same person, really. It's illustrated in a lovely, lovely fashion by Russ Nicholson, whose artwork may be familiar to grognards like me. Yeah, so this would have been roughly when I was starting my RPG career. Probably picked it up second hand, and probably more like 83, 84, when I was about 8 or so, because that's about when I started, I suppose. Being born in 1975. And it's a weird thing. I'm not exactly sure who this book was for, even back then. I mean, you have to take into account that there was some lag between the RPG hobby starting up in the States, spreading to the universities, and making the crossing across the Atlantic to the UK. So this would have been pretty damn early, really, in the rise of RPGs in the UK and the rest of the world. And it's coming from someone who was most famous for writing choose-your-own-adventure books, fighting fantasy. So that makes some of the book make sense, but makes some of it not necessarily make sense. Oh, there are a few people and companies we know get acknowledgements. Our good friend Jamie Thomason, for example, gets a call out for Chapter 3. What's particularly fascinating to me is looking at which games, which companies still exist today in some sort of recognizable form, and which don't. You get a kind of introduction into what a role-playing game is and how it works. I love this illustration of the character breaking free of presumably the player, though why he's in a suit, I don't know. Which is odd because pretty much every RPG has a kind of what is role-playing section. Let me just see if there's a decent passage to read from. Okay, here we go. A role-playing game is a sophisticated form of make-believe in which each player creates a game persona and verbally acts out the part of that persona in a specially designed game world controlled by a referee. Game personas are usually referred to as player characters to distinguish them from the non-player characters operated by the referee, which is a pretty decent, succinct, somewhat technical answer to the question, I suppose. But yeah, this strikes me as being the most unnecessary part. I mean, who is going to be looking for role-playing games other than people who have some idea what they are? Quite a lot of time is spent describing how RPGs are different to other things like board games and so on. That there is typically no board in the box, that it's a free-form system that looks like a build-your-own-game kit. The D20 numbered 0 to 9 twice is all but extinct these days. So, yeah, it's odd. Like I say, I'm not entirely sure who this is for exactly. I mean, it might be useful to bring new people into games. Maybe that's what the idea was, to take people who had enjoyed Choose Your Own Adventure books and to bring them into something wider. And Fighting Fantasy wouldn't do that until the orange cover Were Tiger edition. So maybe this kind of bridged the gap. I can't remember exactly when that came out, but I think it was later. And maybe that explains why this book has a solo adventure with about 150 entries in it. It's basically Fighting Fantasy with the serial numbers rubbed off as far as the character is concerned. It's a little bit bigger. And what I found fascinating was that this solo adventure also describes a way in which you can play it two-player, with one of you reading out the entries and adjudicating the rules, and the other person playing the game. I don't think this book is where I got that idea. Me and a friend did that when we were very, very young. You know, I would read through the book and describe what was going on. They would make the decisions, and I would adjudicate the rules as we went along. So that's what we were already doing, and I don't remember getting it from this book. I suppose I could have, but that's what it describes in here as being the way to play solo adventures, you know, two-player. I mean, having an Ian Livingstone book in this period and not having a solo adventure in it probably would have been seen as a bit of a jip. And maybe that is what this is intended to do, to bring people who were enjoying the solo adventure books, you know, Fighting Fantasy and so on, and to introduce them to the broader role-playing game hobby. Again, I think for me it was that that orange Fighting Fantasy, you know, introductory role-playing game book that did it for me, I think. And that book did it so much better because it actually was a full game, and it had a lot less information about other games and so on in the back of it. But maybe this was a prototype for that book in some ways. Now, what's interesting is to look back at 1982, 1983, and see what kind of games this book is talking about as things that you can get into. There's also this interesting segment on how you go about learning games and the different approaches in different books. So you've got programmed learning. You introduce the player to complex rule systems in stages, bit by bit, building on the previous, so that a book is presented as a way to learn the game, which isn't necessarily the best way to use it as a reference book, but perhaps might be as a way to learn the game. A lot of games used to have Choose Your Own Adventure sections as ways to learn the rules as well, which leans into the second category he has, which is learning by example, where the system is described and then an example is given of how it works. That tends to be the more common approach these days, I suppose. The other way you can learn by example is to watch games being played, which you can now do on YouTube or listening to podcasts, things like that. And then lastly, which is the case for a lot of indie games, is familiarity. You know, you're already familiar with role-playing games or similar games to the type that you want to learn, and so you don't need to be handheld through it. And the games it chooses to talk about are interesting. You've got Dungeons and Dragons, which is actually very different to what is described in this book these days. But obviously that's the granddaddy of them all. And there's some quite in-depth and even somewhat esoteric advice here on how it all works, and some of the central concepts like, yeah, alignment, different races, and so on. RuneQuest gets a mention. RuneQuest is, of course, still with us. This would have been the BRP version, and it describes it as such. and how that all works, and the things that individuate RuneQuest. Traveller is, of course, still with us after many, many incarnations. So for the most part, yeah, Tunnels and Trolls, that's still around as well. It's recently got acquired by another company. And of course, Tunnels and Trolls neatly bookends the kind of choose your own adventure bit, because that was such a big part of Tunnels and Trolls. So all of those are still with us. So I guess we could say that Ian had good taste and knew what was good, what was effective, what had legs. When it gets onto other games, not quite so accurate. Aftermath is no longer with us. BRP is. Behind Enemy Lines, I don't think I've ever heard of. It's the Second World War RPG, when they had a brief renaissance not so long ago, but not a thing you see a lot of. Boot Hill, people know of it, but it's not really around anymore. Bushido, I guess you could say Legend of the Five Rings was its successor, but we don't really have Bushido anymore, which is as good a point as any to say I've been working on a semi-retro clone of Bushido. Call of Cthulhu is still with us. Car Wars isn't an RPG. Why is it here? Champions isn't around so much anymore, but it had some legs for a while. Chivalry and Sorcery. Daredevils, not heard of that one. On Guard isn't really an RPG. Reviewed one of the more recent versions recently. Espionage, don't remember. The Fighting Fantasy game books, of course. Gamma World, kinda still with us until recently. Gangbusters, people remember it, but you don't really have that anymore. Gangster, I suppose, is part of the same subgenre, but never heard of that. James Bond is remembered fondly, but doesn't exist anymore. Land of the Rising Sun, never heard of it. Man, Myth and Magic, heard of it, but don't know anything about it. Merc, don't remember that. Mercenary Spies and Private Eyes, yep, heard of that one. Morrow Project, yep, heard of that, not with us anymore as far as I know. Odysseus, nope. Pirates and Plunder, nope. Privateers and Gentlemen, nope. Skull and Crossbones, nope. Sorcery, that's interlinked single player fantasy game books. Remember those fondly, got a couple of them somewhere. Space Opera, nope. Star Frontiers, well, controversy dogged, but still around. Stormbringer, remembered, but that's about it. Superhero 2044, barely remembered. Supervillains, nope. Superworld, barely remembered. Timeship, nope. Top Secret, got that somewhere. Villains and Vigilantes, yeah, we remember that one. Warhammer is, of course, still with us and huge, but the role-playing game has had its ups and downs. And Wild West, it's an odd selection of choices, many of which are no longer with us. So what's fascinating to me there is that, you know, this is 1982, 1983, 1982 for the first edition, and just the sheer breadth of the genres and so on that are covered by games here, and many of them are genres that we don't really bother with anymore, like Gangbusters, and I don't think there's a big popular espionage RPG at the moment. The Western hasn't ever really come back. You know, we can see space opera and hard science fiction, we can see superheroes and supervillains. You can see games that are more rules light and less serious. You can see games that are more simulationist and serious, which is another thing that's kind of fallen by the wayside. It's an interesting mix, and what's particularly interesting to me is how many of these are no longer with us. Does that reflect the media that people at this time had consumed when they were young, or were still consuming? Because the Western used to be the king of the cinema, you know. and thinking about these people in their adulthood back in the 80s. Their childhood and teen years would have been spaghetti western era, that sort of thing. It's interesting. It's very interesting. Another chapter that you might not see today is about accessories, and again, you can already see that this was a market that already existed back then. So you've got your modules, your rules expansions, your adventures, your miniatures, your maps, the kind of add-ons and so on for all kinds of different games and all kinds of different ways. So also there, we can say, well, there was a lot of stuff, all the same kind of stuff that we see today. They're not necessarily as polished or as effective. And he lists a lot of stuff for all these older games that he's previously mentioned. I saw Palace of the Silver Princess got a mention for Dungeons and Dragons, which is a little odd. Magazines, there's something we don't really have anymore. White Dwarf, which he of course edited, so that got a mention. Used to be a role-playing game magazine. Dragon is no longer really with us. Different Worlds, don't think that's still with us. The Space Gamer and the Fantasy Gamer. Sorcerer's Apprentice. Journal of the Traveller's Aid Society. It wouldn't surprise me if that was still going, given what I know about Traveller Bliss. Nexus, Auto Duel Quarterly, Imagine, Far Traveller, Ares, and then he even lists a few fanzines as well, which I guess would be blogs today. But it's interesting to look back and see an entirely different ecosystem compared to today's mishmash of blogs, social media accounts and groups, the occasional forum, though you don't really see those anymore either. It's so different. And why aren't there more magazines and fanzines? People seem to think that it's not okay to publish fan material or supplementary material without permission when it comes to games, when that was never the case for magazines. You just had to say that you're not asserting copyright or whatever, but you could still publish material, supplementary material for games. And as far as I know, the legal basis hasn't actually changed for that, so there shouldn't be anything in the way of you producing a fanzine for anything, with or without an open gaming license. But hey, I'm not a lawyer. Miniatures played much more of a role back then, I think. Theatre of the Mind was there since the start, but miniatures seems to have been more of a thing back in the past. And this was before we saw a huge boom in miniatures. I mean, Warhammer already existed, but this is before we saw so many different producers. So it's interesting to see the kind of painting tips and advice that would later go on to characterize White Dwarf and heavy metal for quite a while. We then get some specific advice on being a referee, which is always useful. Motivations and objectives for adventures. It's pretty good generic advice, though I suspect a little bit dry and a little bit rules focused compared to the kind of advice that you would give someone today. The use of computers in role-playing is kind of prescient, but this is mostly about actual role-playing computer games, which at the time was largely text adventures or very, very simplistic things. We're talking about the ZX81 and so on here. The Spectrum 48K was around by then, just about, I think. So the capabilities of the computers weren't really weren't really there. But there were computer-moderated play-by-mail games, so you would fill out your turn on a sheet of paper. It would go back to a central place. The people who had the decent enough computers to run the play-by-mail game would input your actions, and the computer would spit out the response, and you would get a printout back. I used to play a gang war one, and did fanzines for a couple of different play-by-mail games back in the day. So, yeah, it's just interesting to look back on what was going on at the start of my role-playing career, and to look at the world around us today, and to get dizzy and to crumble into dust. We even get a segment on LARP. So Treasure Trap gets called out specifically, as does the game Killer by Steve Jackson Games. You don't see Killer being played that much anymore, maybe because people creeping around American campuses with dart guns and holding bananas like pistols are liable to get shot, and in today's atmosphere, leaving suspicious packages or teddy bears and things around as traps for other players is likely to lead to a lockdown, rather than people thinking some sort of fun game is going on. So I guess that's unfortunate. And salon LARPs don't get a mention, but they weren't really a thing for a while either. How do you start? How do you find players? How do you purchase things? Well, there's a mention of some particular game stores. There's talk about putting adverts in magazines and newspapers, which, yeah, that was something we used to do. Used to meet new players that way, and then via forums and so on. But, you know, mail order to these different stores and so on was a way of getting hold of your games if you couldn't make it to the store yourself. But you would have to get a catalogue or a list or something and hope that they had it in stock. I wonder how many of these places still exist. So Games Workshop, obviously. Games of Liverpool, I wonder. TSR Hobbies UK is obviously defunct. I doubt Flying Buffalo still has a British office. Avalon Hill, there's a name from the past. Citadel Miniatures, when it was separate to Games Workshop. It's got addresses of some of the big game companies. I doubt they do that today, because, you know, someone would send them dead animals or a bomb or something. God, what a different world. What a different world indeed. There are game shops. I do wonder if any of these are still around. I should have looked them up first. BTs of London, that's either changed names, and toy shops don't really stock RPGs anymore. They maybe stock a bit of Warhammer, overpriced, but here. Bagnall's, Black Donald's game shop in Aberdeen, I wonder if that's still there. Bateson's Toys, A Booth, Castle Keeps in Windsor. Fascinating. We've lost so many friendly local gaming shops. Many of these were also model shops and wargame shops. So you have to wonder how many of them still exist. Esdevium does. I know Esdevium does. Is Leisure Games in here? Nope. But I guess it wouldn't be. Mike's not that old. Well, yeah, a fascinating artifact of a bygone age, an ancient tome of role-playing secrets by a famous game wizard, and so much of it is useless now the gaming landscape has changed so much, and yet within it you can see that gaming has always been a lot broader, more expansive, covered more ground, and that really there's nothing new under the sun. Even story games and things like that, they already had their ancestors back in the early beginnings of the hobby here in the UK. Who was this for in the end? I think it was for people who were playing single player game books like Fighting Fantasy and so on, and it was there to try and entice them into the rest of the hobby. Of course, Ian is still with us. Someone could ask him, but I think this was a less effective dry run compared to the Orange Were-Tiger introductory RPG that was directly tied to Fighting Fantasy. But I hope you've enjoyed my nostalgia and incredulity at the past. I will see you later. Zang. "Roar," said the grinder as it chewed its way through Alice from the crown of her head all the way down to her toes. It ate the lot of her, unfussy, snout to tail, and cleared its plate. It gnashed its way through her dress, her pinafore, her shoes, and her unmentionables. It chewed her hair, devoured her scalp, gobbled up her arms, wolfed down her legs, gorged itself on her torso, noshed on her skin, and gulped her down without so much as a burp to show for it.